The first thing Damiano Moretti ever loved without question was a girl who was not his sister. He did not know that yet. No one did, except two people in the world, and both of them had spent 11 years burying the truth so deep that even God might have lost the map. He was 9 years old the night they brought her into the house on Whitfield Lane, wrapped in a blanket the colour of cream, her small face scrunched against the cold the way newborns do when they are angry at having been born into a world that did not ask their permission. His mother, Sophia Moretti, held the bundle like it might shatter, and his father, Don Vittorio Moretti, stood in the doorway of the nursery with his hands clasped behind his back, watching with the careful blankness of a man performing a role he had already memorized.
"Your sister," Sophia had whispered to him, kneeling so that Damiano could see the baby's face. "Elena. Say hello to Elena." Damiano remembered staring down at the impossibly small creature, at the dark fuzz of hair and the tiny fist that had escaped the blanket and was waving at nothing. And he remembered the strange, swelling thing that happened in his chest. Not quite love, not yet, but the seed of it, planted in soil that had no business growing what it would eventually grow. "She's ugly," he said, because he was 9, and that's what 9-year-old boys say about babies. "She's yours to protect," his father said. His voice did not invite argument. It rarely did. "No matter what. Do you understand me, Damiano? No matter what happens in this house, in this family, in this life we live, Elena is yours to protect." Damiano had nodded, solemn as a soldier accepting orders, and he had not understood, not really, what those words would come to cost him. He did not know that his father's voice had cracked, almost imperceptibly, on the word yours. He did not know that his mother's eyes were red, not from the exhaustion of childbirth, but from 3 nights of weeping in a locked bathroom, mourning a daughter who had lived only 40 hours before her small lungs had simply stopped, a secret sealed in a private wing of a private hospital, with cash and threats and the particular silence that wealth can buy. He did not know that the baby in his mother's arms had been born 2 counties away to a woman named Caterina Hale, a woman who was not Sophia, to a man who was not Vittorio, but was instead Vittorio's younger brother, Enzo, shot dead in a parking garage in Newark 4 days before this baby drew her first breath, killed by men loyal to a family that wanted every Moretti who carried Enzo's blood erased from the earth. He did not know any of it. He only knew that the baby's fingers, when she finally caught his with her own, were so small they barely closed around the tip of his pinky, and that something in him, something old and instinctive and entirely unprepared for what it would become, decided in that exact moment that he would kill anyone who ever made her cry. He kept that promise more thoroughly than he ever could have imagined. The Moretti estate sat on 11 acres of manicured Long Island silence, hedges trimmed into the same severe geometry year after year, a house with too many rooms and not enough warmth, the kind of place built to announce wealth rather than to live in comfortably. Damiano grew up inside its marble hallways the way other boys grew up inside Little League dugouts, drilled, disciplined, shaped by a sport whose stakes were not trophies, but survival. His father did not believe in childhood as most people understood it. By 12, Damiano could break down and reassemble a pistol with his eyes closed. By 15, he had sat in rooms where men twice his age went quiet when he spoke, because the Don's son had a way of looking at you that made you feel weighed,
measured, found wanting. By 18, he had already killed a man, a debt collector who'd made the mistake of threatening Vittorio Moretti's life over a shipment gone wrong, who'd made the much graver mistake of doing it in front of Elena. She'd been 7. She'd been holding Damiano's hand in the parking lot of a restaurant in Little Italy when the man stepped out of a doorway with a gun half raised, more bluster than intention, the kind of desperate move men make when they've run out of better ideas. Damiano didn't remember deciding to act. He remembered Elena's small hand crushing his fingers, remembered the sound she made, not quite a scream, something smaller and more frightened. And he remembered the gun in his own hand, the one he'd started carrying at 16 against his father's official disapproval and unofficial blessing. And he remembered firing twice before the man's body had even finished registering what was happening. Afterward, in the car, Elena had cried into his shoulder, and he had held her, and he had felt nothing about the dead man behind them except a vague, distant satisfaction, the way one feels about pulling a weed. "You're not scared?" she'd asked him later, much later, when she was old enough to ask real questions. "After what you did?" "I'm not scared of anything that isn't you being unsafe," he'd told her. And she had laughed, because she thought he was being dramatic, the way older brothers sometimes are. She did not know, could not know, that he meant it with the precision of a man stating a fact rather than offering comfort. The world had taught Damiano Moretti many things by the time he was 20 years old, but the most important lesson, the one carved into the architecture of who he would become, was this: Elena Moretti was the only soft thing he was allowed to keep, and he intended to keep her the way a man keeps the last light on in a house full of dark rooms, fiercely, constantly, and without apology to anyone who questioned why. He simply did not yet understand what kind of keeping it was turning into. 12 years later, Damiano Moretti sat at the head of a boardroom table that had once belonged to his father, in a building that laundered 9 different businesses through the same set of accountants, and listened to a man named Carlo Bianchi explain why a shipment of industrial equipment had been delayed at the port of Newark for 6 hours longer than it should have been. He was not, in that moment, thinking about industrial equipment. He was thinking about the text message that had come through 40 minutes earlier from Elena. 3 words long. "Running late. Sorry." He was thinking about the gala she was supposed to be attending tonight at the Moretti Foundation's annual benefit. The one she'd been dreading for 2 weeks, because it meant making small talk with men whose fathers wanted alliances built on her last name. He was thinking, with a low, simmering heat he refused to name even to himself, about who exactly she might be running late with. "Damiano," Carlo's voice cut through. "You hear what I'm saying?" "I heard you." Damiano did not look up from his phone. "Pay the harbour master double next time so this doesn't happen again. I don't care about 6 hours. I care about patterns. Fix the pattern." Carlo nodded, made a note, moved on to the next item on a list that Damiano had stopped truly listening to. He had built, in the 5 years since his father's heart had finally surrendered to a lifetime of cigars and stress, an organization that functioned with terrifying efficiency precisely because he refused to let sentiment touch business. Men who failed him lost fingers before they lost their lives. A calculated mercy meant to remind them that the next failure would not be so generous. Rivals who tested the borders of Moretti territory discovered those borders were patrolled by men who did not sleep and did not negotiate. In the 5 boroughs and the better part of 3 states, the name Moretti had become shorthand for a particular kind of inevitability. Cross us, and the consequence arrives, slow or fast, but it arrives.
There was only one subject on which Damiano Moretti was not inevitable, was not controlled, was not, in any sense that mattered, cold. Boss. Nico, not Nico Greco, but his own lieutenant, a thick-necked man named Nico Falcone, who'd been with the family since before Damiano could shave, leaned in from the doorway. "Car's out front for the benefit. You want me to send someone to pick up Elena, or I'll get her myself?" Damiano was already standing, already buttoning his jacket, with the kind of unhurried precision that masked exactly how fast his pulse had picked up at the mention of her name. "Where is she?" "Said something about finishing up at the gallery, the one on Mercer." Damiano's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The gallery on Mercer was owned by a man named Julian Hayes, a curator with soft hands and a softer reputation among the women of Manhattan's social circuit. A man Damiano had looked into the moment Elena mentioned working with him on a charity art auction 6 weeks ago. Nothing had come of the looking. Yet. Damiano had simply filed the information away in the part of his mind reserved for things that might one day require his attention. The way a man keeps a gun in a drawer he hopes never to open. He told himself, as he had told himself 100 times before, that this was protection. That a man in his position could not afford to let his sister wander unguarded through a city full of people who would use her to get to him, kidnap her for ransom, seduce her for information, marry her for alliance. That the tight, possessive coil low in his stomach whenever another man's name attached itself to hers was simply vigilance wearing an inconvenient disguise. He had been telling himself that lie for years. It was getting harder to believe. The gallery smelled like fresh paint and expensive perfume when he arrived, the kind of sterile elegance that made Damiano's shoulders itch with discomfort. He had never been a man for soft rooms. He found Elena near the back, in a deep green dress that hugged the line of her body in a way that made his jaw clench before he could stop it, laughing at something Julian Hayes had said, her dark hair loose over one shoulder, a champagne flute dangling forgotten from her fingers. She looked, Damiano thought, with the kind of brutal honesty he allowed himself only in the privacy of his own skull, like the only beautiful thing in the entire room that hadn't been bought. "Damiano." Her face lit when she saw him. It always did, that instant, unguarded brightening that no one else on earth earned from her, and it hit him in the chest the way it always had, a soft violence he had never learned to defend against. She crossed the room and looped her arm through his without hesitation, the casual intimacy of a lifetime of being each other's safest place. "You're early. I told you I'd meet you there. I wanted to see the gallery." It wasn't a lie, exactly. He let his gaze slide once, deliberately, to Julian Hayes, who had the good sense to look suddenly very interested in a painting across the room. "Looks like you finished early too." Julian was just thanking me for sourcing the donors. Elena tilted her head up at him, 24 years old and still infuriatingly unaware of the effect she had on grown men in expensive suits. "You didn't have to come get me yourself. You're busy." "I'm never too busy for you." He said it simply, the way he said most things, but something in his voice, a low gravel, a fraction too much weight on the words, made Elena's smile falter for just a second, made her dark eyes search his face the way they sometimes did lately, like she was trying to read a language she half remembered and couldn't quite translate. Damiano. Her voice was softer now, almost careful. You're staring again. Am I not allowed to look at my own sister? It's not looking. She pulled her arm free, smoothed the front of her dress, a small, unconscious gesture of putting distance between them that he hated more than he had any right to. It's something else. You do it sometimes, and I don't know what it is, and it makes me... She stopped herself. He watched her decide not to finish the sentence, watched the careful retreat behind her eyes, and something cold and frightened moved through him, because he knew exactly what word she had swallowed before it could become real between them. Nervous. He had been making his own sister nervous. And instead of stopping, instead of correcting course, instead of doing the one decent thing a brother should do, he felt only the dark, possessive satisfaction of being noticed by her at all, in any way, even the wrong way, even the dangerous way. Come on, he said instead, offering his arm again, his voice smoothed back into something easy, something safe. We're late for your benefit. Let's go remind every man in that room why they should be terrified of you. She laughed, relieved, he thought, to have an exit from whatever had almost surfaced between them, and took his arm, and he walked her out of the gallery, with Julian Hayes's eyes following them both, and he did not look back, because looking back would mean acknowledging the small, ugly flare of triumph he felt at having reclaimed her, even for one night, even from nothing more dangerous than a man with a paintbrush and good manners. He told himself it was protection. He was getting tired of believing himself. The Moretti Foundation's annual benefit was held, as it had been for 11 years, in the ballroom of a hotel on Park Avenue that the family quietly owned through 4 layers of shell corporations, which meant that for one night a year, the city's wealthiest families gathered beneath chandeliers paid for by money that had once moved through ports in the holds of container ships nobody inspected too closely. Elena had grown up inside rooms like this one. She knew the choreography of them, the way she knew her own name, which senator's wife to compliment, which old money widow to let win an argument, which young heir from a rival family to smile at without ever actually promising anything. She had been raised deliberately and thoroughly to be the Moretti family's most beautiful weapon. Not a fighter, not a strategist, but a presence so luminous and so carefully protected that her very existence functioned as a kind of message to the rest of the underworld. This is what we treasure. This is what you will never be allowed to touch. She had understood that role since she was old enough to understand anything, and most of the time she did not resent it. Tonight, in her green silk dress, with her brother's eyes following her across the room like a held breath, she found herself resenting it more than usual. Eleanor Moretti. The voice belonged to Panico Greco, son of Don Salvatore Greco, head of the family that controlled most of Brooklyn's waterfront, and had been, for 2 generations, the Moretti's closest thing to an equal. He was handsome in the practiced way of men who had been told they were handsome since childhood. His smile a fraction too confident as he took her hand and pressed it lightly to his lips.
You get more breathtaking every year. It's becoming a problem for the rest of us. Nico. She kept her own smile pleasant, professional, the smile she'd been trained to wear since she was 12. How's your father? Eager to talk to yours, or to your brother now, I suppose. Nico's eyes flicked briefly across the room, and Elena followed the look without meaning to. Found Damiano already watching them from beside the bar, a glass of scotch untouched in his hand, his expression unreadable to anyone who hadn't spent a lifetime learning to read it. To Elena, it was perfectly legible. It said, "I am one wrong word away from breaking something." My father wants to discuss the new shipping arrangement, Nico continued, oblivious or pretending to be. But honestly, Elena, I came over here for a different reason. Did you? I'd like to take you to dinner. Properly. Not at one of these things where we're both performing for an audience. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice into something he probably thought was charming. Two old families, Elena. It would make a great deal of sense, you and me, politically, personally. She had heard versions of this proposal from at least 4 men in the past 2 years, all of them sons of dons, all of them looking at her not as a woman, but as a merger waiting to be finalised, and she had grown skilled at deflecting it with humour and grace. She did not get the chance to deflect this one. Nico. Damiano's voice arrived a half-second before his hand landed, with deliberate gentleness, on the small of Elena's back. A touch that was, on its surface, entirely brotherly, and that nonetheless made the hair on the back of her neck rise with an awareness she did not want to examine. I think my sister's already overbooked this season. Funny, Nico said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes anymore. I wasn't asking you, Damiano. No. Damiano's own smile was a blade dressed up as courtesy. But you should have. The two men stared at each other for a long moment, the kind of silence that, in their world, said more than entire conversations. And Elena felt the familiar, exhausting weight of being a piece on a board she had never agreed to play on. Around them the gala continued, laughter, music, the clink of glasses, utterly unaware that 2 of the city's most dangerous men were having a conversation that, in any other context, would have ended in bloodshed. "Tell your father," Damiano said finally, "that I'll consider the shipping arrangement on its own merits, not as a package deal with my sister." Nico's jaw tightened, but he was, beneath the bravado, smart enough to know which fights were winnable. Of course. He turned back to Elena, softening his voice, performing graciousness now for whatever audience might be watching. "Elena, if you ever want to escape the family business for one evening, you know where to find me." He left. Elena watched him go, and then turned to find Damiano watching her instead, his hand still resting at the small of her back, warm through the silk of her dress, and she became abruptly, uncomfortably aware of how close he was standing, of the particular intensity with which he was looking at her, not the protective scan he gave every room they entered, but something narrower, something that felt almost like he was searching her face for an answer to a question he hadn't asked out loud. "You didn't have to do that," she said, stepping back, putting half a foot of space between them that felt, somehow, like more. "He was treating you like a contract." He was flirting, Damiano, badly, but it was flirting. I can handle a bad flirt. Can you? It wasn't really a question. Did you want to go to dinner with him? No. The honesty surprised even her. But that's not the point. The point is you can't keep doing this, scaring off every man who so much as looks at me. People are starting to talk. Let them talk. Damiano. She searched his face, frustration warring with something else, something warmer and more frightening that she pushed down hard. I'm 24. I'm allowed to date. I'm allowed to have a life outside of being your... She stopped. Again, the way she'd stopped at the gallery, the sentence going somewhere she didn't want to follow it. My what? His voice had gone very quiet, very careful, and his eyes, God, his eyes, dark and steady and entirely too focused, held hers in a way that made her stomach drop in a manner that had absolutely nothing to do with fear. Finish it, Elena. My what? She didn't answer. She couldn't, because the word that wanted to come out of her mouth wasn't sister, and they both knew it, and the silence between them stretched out across the crowded, glittering room like something fragile, threatening to crack. We should go say hello to the Castellanos, she said finally, turning away before he could see whatever was happening on her own face. Before this gets weirder than it already is. Damiano let her walk a step ahead of him and watched the line of her back, the way her shoulders had gone tight with whatever she was refusing to feel, and felt the same tightness in his own chest, a mirror of hers, a matched and terrible thing neither of them had agreed to carry. 3 weeks later, Elena stood in the private booth of Onyx, the nightclub the Moretti family owned outright. No shell corporations necessary, just a sleek black building on the edge of the meatpacking district where the bass lived in your sternum and the bottles cost more than most people's rent, and watched her brother dismantle a man's evening with nothing but a look. She hadn't meant to start anything. She'd come to Onyx with her cousin Vivian and 2 friends from her gallery committee, intending to have one normal night, one night where she wasn't Elena Moretti, Mafia princess, but just Elena, 24, dancing badly to music too loud to think over. For an hour, it had even worked. She'd had 2 drinks she didn't finish, laughed at something stupid Vivian said, let a stranger, a good-looking stranger with an easy smile, no rings, no obvious tells of the underworld, buy her a 3rd drink and ask her to dance. His name was Theo. He worked in finance, or said he did. He had good hands and better rhythm, and for 20 minutes, with the music pounding and the lights sliding colours across the floor, Elena had felt something close to ordinary, and it had been wonderful. Then she'd looked up toward the VIP section and found Damiano already there, already watching, and the ordinary feeling had died in her chest like a snuffed candle. He hadn't come down right away. That was somehow worse. He'd simply stood at the railing of the upper level with a drink he wasn't drinking, his attention a physical weight she could feel from 30 feet away through a crowd of 200 people. And she'd watched Theo's easy smile falter as he too became aware of being observed. "Is that guy with you?" Theo had asked, nodding up toward the VIP section. "That's my brother." Christ, why is he looking at me like that? "Ignore him," she'd said, though she knew, even as the words left her mouth, that it was useless advice. Nobody ignored Damiano Moretti when he looked at you like that. 20 minutes later, Theo excused himself to the bar and never came back. Elena found out why 3 days afterward from Vivian, who'd heard it from one of the bartenders.
Damiano had sent Nico Falcone down to have a quiet word, had Theo's name and employer pulled up on a phone screen before the man had even reached the bar, had let him understand, in the calm and bloodless language the Moretti organization specialized in, that whatever he thought might happen tonight with Elena Moretti was not, in fact, going to happen. Not tonight. Not ever. Not with him. Not with anyone Damiano hadn't personally vetted and approved. He didn't touch him, Vivian said, half laughing, half appalled, when she told Elena. Didn't have to. The guy looked like he'd seen a ghost, practically ran out of there. Elena had said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound, even to her own ears, like an admission of something she wasn't ready to name. But that night, lying awake in her room in the Manhattan penthouse she shared with her brother, 3 floors of glass and steel, 40 stories above the city, a fortress disguised as luxury, she found herself doing the things she'd been doing more and more often lately, replaying the moment Damiano's eyes had found hers across the club, trying to identify exactly what had been in them. It wasn't anger. She knew anger. She'd grown up around men whose anger could rearrange a room. What lived in Damiano's eyes when he watched another man's hands on her body was something else entirely. Something starved and dark and possessive in a way that had no business existing between siblings. Something that made her stomach drop and her skin heat in a confusing, shameful tangle she didn't have language for and didn't want to find. She got up at 2 a.m. and walked the length of the penthouse's east wing, past the floor-to-ceiling windows that turned Manhattan into a field of gold lights, and found Damiano exactly where she somehow knew he'd be, in his study, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a glass of scotch he hadn't touched, sitting beside a stack of shipping manifests he wasn't reading. "You're up late," she said from the doorway. "So are you." "I heard about Theo." Something in his jaw shifted, almost a flinch, quickly smoothed away. "I don't know what you mean." "Damiano." She crossed the room and sat on the edge of his desk, an old habit from childhood, a place she'd claimed since she was small enough that her feet didn't reach the floor from it. "You scared off a perfectly nice finance guy because he was dancing with me at a club. He had his hand on your waist. That's what dancing is. He was looking at you like he had plans. Maybe he did. Maybe I wanted him to." The words came out sharper than she intended, fueled by 3 weeks of frustration she hadn't quite admitted to herself, and she watched them land on him like a physical blow, watched his hands go still on the desk, watched something flash through his dark eyes that was gone before she could name it. "Did you?" he said. His voice had dropped into something low and careful, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with violence. "I don't know." She looked away first, toward the window, toward the city's indifferent glow. "I don't know what I wanted. I just wanted one night where I wasn't being managed, Damiano, watched, protected from every man who looks at me twice. I can't apologize for protecting you." "This isn't protection." She turned back to him, and the admission cost her something to say, something that had been building for months, maybe years, finally cracking loose. "Protection is what you do when there's a threat. Theo wasn't a threat. He was a guy at a club. What you did tonight wasn't about keeping me safe. It was about something else. And I think you know exactly what. And I think it scares you as much as it scares me.
The silence that followed was the longest of Elena's life. Damiano didn't move, didn't speak, didn't do anything except look at her with an intensity that made the air in the room feel thinner, like the study itself was holding its breath. And for one terrifying, electric second, she thought he might actually say it, might let the truth they'd both been circling for months finally surface between them, ugly and undeniable and impossible to take back. Instead, he reached for the scotch he hadn't touched all night, swallowed it in one motion, and said, in a voice scraped raw and carefully, deliberately flat, "Go to bed, Elena. It's late." She went. She didn't sleep. Neither, judging by the light still burning under his study door at 4 in the morning, did he. Memory, for Elena, worked like weather. It arrived without warning and changed the entire colour of a day. She was 16 the first time she noticed something had shifted in the way Damiano looked at her, though she hadn't had the vocabulary for it then, only the vague, unsettled sense that something had moved beneath the surface of their relationship, like a current changing direction. She had come downstairs in a new dress, midnight blue, bought for her first real dance at the private school the family insisted she attend, despite knowing none of the other girls there could ever truly be her friends. And she had found Damiano in the foyer, waiting to inspect her before she left, the way he always did, the self-appointed gatekeeper of every door she walked through. He had gone very still when he saw her. "You look—" He'd stopped, started again. "You can't wear that." "What's wrong with it? Nothing's wrong with it." His voice had an edge she didn't recognize. "That's the problem." She'd worn a different dress that night, one he approved of, modest and unremarkable, and she had gone to the dance and danced with a boy named Peter Ann, who held her too far away and asked about her family's import business, in a way that made it obvious he was fishing for something his father wanted to know. And she'd come home, disappointed in a way she couldn't articulate, and found Damiano waiting up for her in the kitchen, the way he always did, 20 years old and already more frightening to most men than his own father. "Did you have fun?" he'd asked. "It was fine." "Just fine?" "Peter Ann is boring." She'd dropped onto a stool at the kitchen island, exhausted in the particular way of teenagers who have performed an entire evening of social choreography. "And I think his dad sent him to find out things about us." Something dark had flickered across Damiano's face. Not surprise, she remembered thinking even then, but confirmation of a suspicion he'd already held. "I'll look into it." "Damiano, it's a high school dance. Not everything is a conspiracy." "Everything involving you is a conspiracy until I've confirmed it isn't." He'd said it simply, without drama, the way he said most things, and then he'd done something he rarely did, reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek a half-second longer than the gesture required, his eyes dropping to her mouth for the briefest, most deniable instant before he caught himself and stepped back like he'd touched a flame. "Go to bed," he'd said, voice rough. "It's late." She hadn't understood at 16 what she'd witnessed. She'd gone to bed, confused and a little flattered, and entirely unaware that she'd just watched her brother fight a battle against himself and lose ground he would spend years trying to reclaim. She understood it now, at 24, with the perfect clarity of hindsight and 8 more years of watching that same battle play out in 100 smaller moments.
the way he never let another man's hand stay too long on her waist, the way his eyes tracked the hemline of her dresses with an attention that had nothing to do with brotherly disapproval, the way he sometimes looked at her across a room with an expression so naked and so wrong that she had to look away first because she didn't trust what her own face might be doing in response. She had spent a year now, quietly, secretly, with the particular shame of a person convinced she was the only one carrying a sickness, trying to name what had grown between them. She had told herself it was nothing. She had told herself it was the natural result of a childhood spent too close, too dependent, an only children's intensity mistaken for something else by two people who didn't have enough other intimacy in their lives to dilute it. She had told herself a dozen comforting lies, and every single one of them had dissolved the moment Damiano walked into a room and her pulse did something it had no business doing for a man who shared her blood. Shared her blood. The phrase sat in her mind like a stone she couldn't stop turning over. They were siblings, full siblings as far as she knew, same mother, same father, the same dark hair and the same particular shape of their eyes that strangers sometimes remarked on. "You two look so alike," a comment that used to make her proud and now made something in her stomach twist with something closer to dread. What she felt for Damiano was not the love of a sister. She had loved her brother her entire life, fiercely and uncomplicatedly, until somewhere in the last few years that love had metastasized into something with teeth, something that ached in her chest when he touched the small of her back, something that made her dream and wake, ashamed of the dreaming, about his hands in places a brother's hands had no right to be. She had decided, sometime around her 23rd birthday, a fundamentally broken person. She had simply chosen not to examine the wound too closely, because some part of her, the same part that lit up every time he walked into a room, did not actually want to be healed. She didn't know, yet, that 400 miles away, in a hospital archive in a small Pennsylvania town neither of them had ever visited, a sealed file sat in a locked cabinet with her name on it, and a different name beneath it, waiting like a held breath for someone to finally open the drawer. The announcement came on a Tuesday, delivered by Sophia Moretti over a breakfast that suddenly tasted for Elena like ash. "Salvatore Greco called your brother this morning," Sophia said, stirring sugar into her coffee with the particular calm she deployed whenever she was about to say something that wouldn't be well received. At 61, Sophia Moretti remained a woman of formidable composure, silver-streaked dark hair always perfectly set, the kind of beauty that had not faded so much as sharpened into something more dangerous with age. "He's proposing a formal alliance between the families. We have an alliance with the Grecos." Elena set down her fork. "We've had one for 30 years. He's proposing we make it permanent." Sophia's eyes, when they finally lifted to meet Elena's, held an apology that did nothing to soften the words that followed. "A marriage, Elena. You and Nico." The kitchen went very quiet. Across the table, Damiano's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth, and Elena watched, with a strange detached clarity, the way his knuckles whitened around the porcelain. "No," he said. Just that. One word, flat and absolute, the same tone he used to end negotiations with men who'd come to beg for mercy. "Damiano." Sophia's voice carried the patient weariness of a woman who had been managing her son's temper since he was old enough to have one. "This isn't your decision alone to make."
It's not anyone's decision but Elena's. His jaw was a hard line, and Elena could see the effort it took him to keep his voice level, to keep whatever was happening underneath the surface from breaking through. She's not a contract clause. I'm aware of what she is. Something flickered across Sophia's face, too fast for Elena to read, gone before she could try. But you understand the position we're in. Salvatore is not a man who likes to hear no, and we need the Greco shipping lanes if we're going to keep the Russians out of our territory next year. This marriage would secure that for a generation. I'm not marrying Nico Greco. Elena's own voice surprised her, steadier than she felt, edged with a defiance she usually reserved for nothing more dangerous than disagreements over party seating charts. I don't care what it secures. I'm not a shipping lane. No one's saying you have to love him. Sophia's tone gentled, became almost coaxing, the voice she'd used to talk Elena through childhood's scraped knees and adolescent heartbreaks. These arrangements aren't about love, Eleanor. They're about survival. Your father married me for the exact same reasons, and we built a life together. A good life. Love can come later, or it can not come at all, and the marriage still serves its purpose. That's not the kind of life I want. What you want, Damiano said, his voice cutting through with a finality that made both women turn to him, is irrelevant, because it's not happening. Mother, you can tell Salvatore that the alliance stands as it is. The shipping arrangement, the territory agreements, all of it. But Elena is not on the table. Not now, not ever. And if he has a problem with that, he can bring it to me directly instead of using my mother to soften his negotiations. Sophia studied her son for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her composed expression. Not quite surprise, Elena thought, watching the exchange with the growing, uneasy sense of having stepped into a conversation that had layers she couldn't see. It looked almost like recognition, almost like fear. You should be careful, Damiano, Sophia said finally, quietly, about how this looks. To Salvatore, to the Commission. A Don who can't be reasoned with on matters of family business is a Don people start to wonder about. Let them wonder. And to your sister. Sophia's eyes moved to Elena, and something in them made Elena's stomach tighten with a dread she couldn't name. How this looks to her. How it's always looked. The sentence hung in the air, weighted with something Elena didn't understand, and Damiano, judging by the sudden rigid stillness of his whole body, understood completely. He didn't respond. He simply stood, set down his coffee cup with exaggerated care, as if controlling the motion was the only thing keeping him from breaking the cup outright, and left the room without another word. Elena sat across from her mother in the sudden ringing silence, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the marriage proposal and everything to do with the look that had passed between Sophia and Damiano. A look that contained an entire conversation Elena hadn't been invited to. Mom? Her voice came out smaller than she intended. What did you mean by that? How it's always looked? Sophia's composure didn't crack, but something behind her eyes shuttered closed, a door pulled firmly shut. Nothing, Cara. I'm tired, and your brother makes me say things I don't mean when he gets like this. She reached across the table and squeezed Elena's hand, her rings cold against Elena's skin. Forget the marriage. He's right. It's not happening. Finish your breakfast. Elena finished her breakfast. She did not forget the marriage, and she did not forget the look on her mother's face,
And that night, lying awake in the dark of her bedroom, with the city humming 40 stories below, she found herself turning the moment over and over, certain, with the particular dreadful certainty of a person finally noticing the shape of something that has been hiding in plain sight her entire life, that there was a secret in her family far larger than which Mafia Don's son she would or wouldn't marry. She did not yet have the courage to go looking for it. She would, soon enough, regret how easily that courage finally arrived. Salvatore Greco did not take the rejection well, and his son took it worse. It started small. A delayed payment on the shipping arrangement that should have arrived clean, a comment dropped at a commission dinner about how the Morettis seemed to be having trouble managing their assets, a photographer who showed up outside Elena's gallery committee meeting and got a little too close before Damiano's security detail intervened. By the time Nico Greco cornered Elena outside a restaurant on Mulberry Street on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the breakfast that had ended in her brother's cold fury, the temperature between the two families had dropped low enough that everyone in their world understood a reckoning was coming. "You embarrassed me," Nico said, blocking her path on the sidewalk with the kind of casual menace men like him mistook for charm. He'd had a few drinks. She could smell it on him, sour and confident. "You know that? Whole commission heard your brother turned me down, like I wasn't good enough for his precious little sister." "Nico, please move." "I would have been good to you, Elena." His voice took on something uglier, wounded pride curdling into something darker. "Better than you deserve, considering what people say about you." "What is that supposed to mean?" "Means everyone wonders why Damiano Moretti can't let another man near you without losing his mind. Means people talk, Elena, about how a man protects his sister." He said the word with deliberate, ugly emphasis, his eyes raking down her body in a way that made her skin crawl. "Real strange kind of protective, if you ask half the commission." She felt the blood drain from her face, felt a hot, sick shame rise up her throat that she didn't fully understand and desperately wanted to deny. And she opened her mouth to tell him to go to hell. And that was the exact moment a car door slammed somewhere behind her, and the sidewalk seemed to drop 10 degrees in temperature. She didn't need to turn around to know. She felt him arrive, the way some people feel a change in barometric pressure before a storm. "Nico." Damiano's voice was almost gentle, which was, Elena had learned over a lifetime of watching him, the most dangerous register he possessed. "You want to repeat what you just said to my face?" Nico's bravado wavered, but the alcohol and the wound to his pride kept him standing his ground. "I was just talking to Elena. We're old friends." "You were standing too close to her on a public street and saying things that made her go pale." Damiano stepped between them with the unhurried ease of a man who had never once in his adult life questioned whether he could win a confrontation. "I'm going to ask you one more time. What did you say to her?" "Damiano, it's fine." Elena reached for his arm, some instinct screaming at her to diffuse this before it became the kind of thing that ended with bodies. "He was just being a jerk. Let's go." "What did you say?" Damiano didn't move, didn't look at her. His entire focus narrowed on Nico Greco with an intensity that made the other man finally take a half step back. "I said people talk." Nico's chin lifted, some last reserve of bravado, pushing the words out even as his eyes betrayed the fear finally catching up to him. "About you and her."
about how a brother doesn't look at his sister the way you look at Elena. Everyone's noticed it, Damiano. Even Vivian's mother was saying something at the gala about how unnatural it... He didn't finish the sentence. Damiano's fist connected with his jaw before the last word had fully left his mouth. A single, brutal strike that dropped Nico Greco onto the sidewalk in a sprawl of expensive fabric and wounded dignity. And for one frozen second, Elena stood very still, staring down at the man bleeding on the pavement, understanding with sudden, vertiginous clarity that the rumour Nico had just spat out wasn't an insult invented in the moment. It was something people had genuinely noticed, something real enough to talk about at galas in the particular cruel whisper network of the city's wealthiest families, a rumour with enough truth in its bones to survive repetition. "Get up," Damiano said to Nico, his voice flat and cold, all trace of gentleness gone. "Get up and get out of my sight before I decide this conversation isn't over." Nico scrambled upright, wiping blood from his split lip, and retreated toward his waiting car without another word, casting one last look back at Elena, not triumphant despite the bruise forming on his jaw, but almost pitying, as though he'd just watched her walk willingly into a fire she didn't know was burning. Damiano turned to her. His hand, when it found her shoulder, was shaking. Not with adrenaline, she realized, but with something else, something that looked almost like fear. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Did he touch you? Did he—" "Damiano." Her voice came out unsteady, the shock of the violence and the words underneath it colliding into something she couldn't separate. "What he said. About people talking. He's a drunk idiot with a bruised ego. Ignore him. He's not the first person to say something like that to me." The admission came out before she could stop it, dragged up from somewhere she'd been keeping it buried for months. "I've heard things. Looks. People being weird around us at parties. I always told myself I was imagining it." Damiano went very still, his hand still on her shoulder, his face caught in the streetlight, in an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the cold calculation he wore for business, not the fierce protectiveness he wore for her, but something raw and exposed, and terribly, terribly afraid. "Elena, what is it?" she pressed, her own heart hammering now, some instinct telling her she was standing at the edge of something irreversible. "What aren't you telling me?" For one long, suspended moment, she thought he might finally say it. She watched the words gather behind his eyes, watched his throat work as he fought whatever battle he'd been fighting in private for years, and her whole body went taut with a terror that had nothing to do with Nico Greco bleeding on the sidewalk 30 feet away. Then his jaw clenched, and the moment closed like a door, and he stepped back from her with visible, deliberate effort. "Nothing," he said. "Let's get you home." He didn't touch her on the drive back to the penthouse. He sat as far from her as the car allowed, his hands gripping the wheel with white-knuckled tension, and Elena watched the city slide past the window and understood, with a dread that settled into her bones like cold water, that whatever was happening between them had just been given a name by a stranger on a sidewalk, and that names, once spoken aloud, had a way of becoming impossible to unspeak. It happened on a night that began, like so many of their unravelling moments did, with nothing more dramatic than a thunderstorm. The power flickered twice across the city and finally surrendered around 11, plunging the penthouse into a darkness lit only by the storm lightning outside the floor-to-ceiling windows and the battery-powered emergency lights that clicked on in the hallways with a soft, mechanical hum. Elena found Damiano in the living room, 2 candles already lit on the coffee table. He had grown up in a house run by a man who distrusted relying entirely on the grid, and some habits never left him. A glass of scotch in his hand, his tie long since discarded, his collar open at the throat, in a way that did something unhelpful to Elena's concentration. "Power's out across half the city," he said, not looking up as she came in. "Should be back within the hour." "I don't mind." She settled onto the opposite end of the couch, drawing her knees up beneath her, watching the lightning carve white fractures across the black sky beyond the glass. "It's nice. Quiet." They sat in a silence that had once been comfortable and had, in recent months, become charged with something neither of them acknowledged out loud. A silence full of careful distance, of eyes that didn't quite meet, of 2 people sitting 4 feet apart on a couch and working very hard to make it feel like more. "Do you remember?" Eleanor said finally, because the dark and the storm and the strange suspended quality of the night made her braver than usual. "The summer we lost power at the lake house. You were maybe 17? We played cards by candlelight until like 3 in the morning, and Dad found us asleep on the porch." "I remember." Something softened in his voice, the memory pulling him briefly out of whatever careful armour he'd been wearing all evening. "You cheated at every hand." "I did not. You absolutely did. You used to hide cards in your sleeve like a cartoon villain. I was 11, Damiano. You were a menace at 11. You're a menace now. You've just gotten more sophisticated about it." He was smiling, actually smiling, the rare, unguarded expression that transformed his whole face into something younger, something that belonged to the boy who'd once promised to protect her before he'd fully understood what that promise would cost him. Elena felt something in her chest crack open at the sight of it. Want and tenderness, so tangled together she couldn't separate them anymore. "I miss this," she said quietly. "You, like this. Lately you're always so what? Far away, even when you're standing right next to me." She studied him in the candlelight, his face half-shadowed, half-gold, and the words came out before she could stop them, raw and unguarded in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be in months. "I feel like I'm losing you to something, and I don't know what it is, and it terrifies me." Damiano set down his scotch with exaggerated care, the same gesture he'd used at the breakfast table weeks ago, the gesture of a man trying very hard not to break something. "You're not losing me," he said, his voice low and rough. "I'm right here. I've always been right here." "Then why does it feel like there's a wall between us that wasn't there before?" "Because there has to be." The words seemed to escape him before he could stop them, and Elena watched something crack open in his expression, watched years of careful control finally start to splinter. "Because if there wasn't, Elena, I don't know what I'd do, and the not knowing scares me more than anything I've faced in this life." "What do you mean?" Her own voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, the storm outside suddenly very loud in the silence between them. "Damiano, what do you mean?" He looked at her then, really looked, the way he had at the gallery, the way he had 100 times over the past year, with an intensity that stripped away every pretense of brotherly concern and left something underneath that was raw and hungry and entirely without disguise. The candlelight caught the dark of his eyes and turned them molten, and Elena found she couldn't breathe, couldn't look away, couldn't do anything except feel the 4 feet of distance between them on the couch collapse into something far more dangerous than physical space. "Tell me you don't feel it too," he said, his voice a rasp, "and I'll stop. Right now, tonight. I'll bury it so deep neither of us ever has to look at it again. But you have to tell me, Elena. You have to look me in the eye and tell me you don't feel what I feel. Because I can't keep pretending I don't see it in you. I see it every time you look at me. I've seen it for years." She opened her mouth to lie. She had a lie ready, had been rehearsing it in the privacy of her own guilt for longer than she wanted to admit. "I don't know what you're talking about. You're my brother. This is insane." And the lie died somewhere in her throat, because his hand had found her cheek, warm and trembling in a way she'd never felt from him before, and his thumb traced the line of her jaw with a tenderness that obliterated every defence she'd built. "I can't," she whispered. "Damiano, I can't say that. God help me, I can't." The sound he made was almost pain, almost relief. A low, broken noise from somewhere deep in his chest, and then his forehead was against hers, his breath ragged, both of them frozen at the precipice of something they had spent years building walls against, walls that had just, in one stormlit moment, come down entirely. "This is wrong," she breathed, even as her hand found the front of his shirt, even as her whole body leaned into him instead of away. "Damiano, this is so wrong. Don't." His voice broke on the word. "Don't say it. Please, Elena. Just for tonight. Don't say it." She didn't. For one suspended, weightless moment, with the storm raging outside, and the candles burning low, and his mouth a breath away from hers, she let herself believe that not saying it might be enough to make it not true. Then the lights flickered back on with a sudden electric hum, fluorescent and unforgiving, and the spell shattered like glass. They pulled apart so fast it was almost violent, both of them scrambling back to opposite ends of the couch, both of them breathing hard, both of them staring at anything except each other. Elena pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Damiano dragged both hands through his hair and stood so abruptly the coffee table rattled. "That didn't happen," he said, his voice rough and unsteady, his back to her. "Elena, that didn't happen. We're going to forget it happened." "Damiano, I need you to forget it happened." He finally turned, and his face had reassembled itself into something controlled, something terrible in its sudden distance. "Because if we don't, I don't know what I become. Good night, Elena." He left the room without waiting for her answer, and Elena sat alone in the lit-up living room, with her heart still pounding and her lips still tingling from a kiss that had never actually landed, and understood, with a despair that settled deep into her bones, that some doors, once opened even a crack, could never be fully closed again. Sofia Moretti had not survived 3 decades married to a Mafia don and 5 more running half his empire from the shadows after his death by failing to notice things. She noticed at the family dinner 2 Sundays after the storm that her son and her daughter could not look at each other for longer than a heartbeat without one of them finding an excuse to stare at their plate. She noticed that Damiano's hand, when he reached for the bread basket, flinched away from accidental contact with Elena's fingers, as though her skin burned him.
She noticed that Elena laughed a half-second too late at jokes, distracted, somewhere else entirely, her eyes flicking to her brother and away again, with the particular guilty rhythm of a person trying very hard not to look at something. She noticed, and her stomach dropped with a dread so old and so familiar it felt like greeting an unwelcome ghost. She had feared this for years. She had watched it building in smaller increments since Damiano was 19 and had broken a boy's nose for putting his hands on 14-year-old Elena at a school dance. A reaction so disproportionate to the offence that Vittorio had quietly pulled her aside that same night and said, in the careful, worried voice he reserved for problems too large to solve with money or violence, "Sophia, I think we have a problem with the boy." They had told themselves, both of them, that it would pass, that it was the natural overprotectiveness of a boy raised to believe his sister's safety was his sole purpose, a devotion that would mature into something appropriately distant as they both grew older, married, built separate lives. They had told themselves that lie for a decade, watching it curdle instead into something neither of them had the courage to name out loud, not even to each other, not even in the privacy of their own marriage bed, where Vittorio had finally, in his last year of life, whispered the fear that had haunted him since the children were small. What if it never passes, Sophia? What if we built this house on a lie, and the lie is going to destroy them both? He had died 18 months later of a heart that simply gave out, and Sophia had carried his fear alone ever since, watching her son become a man feared across 3 states, watching her daughter blossom into a woman who turned heads in every room she entered, and watching, with growing horror, the thing growing between them that had no name fit for polite conversation, and no solution fit for a family whose entire empire rested on the appearance of unimpeachable legitimacy. After dinner, she found Damiano alone on the terrace, a cigarette burning between his fingers, a habit he'd quit years ago and apparently resumed, judging by the half-empty pack on the railing beside him. "You're smoking again," she said, observant as ever. Damiano. She came to stand beside him, looking out over the city rather than at him, giving him the small mercy of not having to meet her eyes for what she was about to say. "I need you to tell me the truth about something, and I need you to actually answer me instead of deflecting the way you've been deflecting your entire life." He didn't respond, which was, in itself, an answer. "What's happening between you and your sister?" The cigarette stilled between his fingers. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the city 40 stories below, the wind moving against the glass railing, and Sophia waited, with the particular patience of a woman who had spent her entire adult life waiting for men to find the courage to say true things. "Nothing's happening," he said finally, his voice flat in a way that fooled neither of them. "Damiano." "What do you want me to say, Mum?" The flatness cracked just slightly, and underneath it Sophia heard something raw and exhausted, something that had clearly been carrying its own weight for far too long alone. "That I look at her and feel things a brother shouldn't feel? That I've spent years trying to bury it, and it just keeps coming back? Worse every time? Is that what you want to hear?" Sophia closed her eyes briefly, the confirmation landing in her chest like a stone she'd been expecting and dreading in equal measure. "I want you to fix it, before it destroys her, and you, and everything your father built." "You think I haven't tried?" He flicked the cigarette over the railing, watched the ember fall away into the dark. "I've tried for years. I've thrown myself into business, into other women, into anything I could find to make it go away, and none of it works, because it's not—" He stopped himself, but Sophia heard the rest of the sentence anyway, in the silence that followed. "It's not just attraction. It's not something I can screw out of my system with some other woman. It's her, specifically, and it's not going anywhere. You have to end it." Sophia turned to face him fully now, her voice low and urgent. "Whatever this is, whatever it's becoming, you have to end it before anyone outside this family notices. Do you understand what would happen if word got out? The Commission would use it to strip your legitimacy. The Grecos would use it to destroy us. You would lose everything your father built, and you would take Elena down with you. And I will not." Her voice broke, finally, the composure she'd maintained for 30 years cracking under the weight of a fear she'd carried alone for too long. "I will not lose another child to this family's sins, Damiano. I won't survive it twice." The words hung in the air, strange and specific, and Damiano's head turned sharply toward her, something flickering in his expression, confusion, sharp and immediate, cutting through the raw grief of the conversation. "What do you mean?" he said slowly. "Another child." Sophia went very still. The wind moved against the glass. Somewhere below them, the city hummed on, indifferent to the precipice she had just, in a moment of exhausted grief, walked them both to the edge of. "Nothing," she said, too quickly, the practiced composure slamming back down over her face like a shutter. "I misspoke. I'm tired, and this conversation has upset me. Forget I said anything." "Mom." He stepped toward her, his own fear about Elena momentarily eclipsed by something sharper, something instinctive that recognized the sound of a lie even in his own mother's mouth. "What aren't you telling me?" "There's nothing to tell." Sophia turned and walked back toward the terrace doors, her spine rigid, her steps measured and controlled, in a way that did nothing to disguise how badly her hands were shaking. "Fix this thing with your sister, Damiano. That's all that matters right now. That's all that has ever mattered." She disappeared back into the penthouse, and Damiano stood alone on the terrace in the cold night air, his mother's words echoing in his skull. "I will not lose another child." Turning over a question he had never once in his life thought to ask, because he had never had a single reason to doubt that Elena Moretti was exactly who everyone, including himself, had always believed her to be. He had a reason now. He just didn't yet understand how large it was going to become. The Greco retaliation, when it came hard and came fast, and came exactly where the Morettis were most vulnerable. It happened on a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks after the confrontation on Mulberry Street, while Elena was leaving a meeting with the Foundation's board at a building on Fifth Avenue that her family's security had walked 100 times, and had, in the comfort of routine, stopped fully scrutinizing. She had 2 bodyguards with her, competent men, well-trained, men who had protected her without incident for years, and that was, in the end, exactly the problem. Routine breeds blind spots, and Salvatore Greco's men had spent 2 months studying that routine with the patience of hunters who understood that the biggest prizes require the longest waits. The van came from the service alley beside the building, 4 men inside it, faces covered, moving with the kind of brutal efficiency that suggested professional money behind the operation rather than amateur rage. The first bodyguard went down with a blow to the back of the skull before he registered the threat. The second got off one shot, wide, panicked, before a second man put him on the ground with a knee to the throat. Elena had time to scream once, a single sharp sound swallowed almost instantly by a gloved hand, before she was hauled bodily into the van, the doors slamming shut, the vehicle peeling away from the curb in under 90 seconds total. Damiano was in a meeting 40 blocks downtown when Nico Falcone burst through the door without knocking, his face the colour of ash, and said 4 words that ended Damiano Moretti's entire understanding of what control over his own composure actually meant. They took Elena. Now. What happened in the 4 hours that followed would become, in the careful retellings of men who'd witnessed it, something approaching legend within the organization, the kind of story whispered with a mixture of awe and genuine fear, the story of the night the Moretti Don stopped being merely dangerous and became something closer to elemental. He didn't shout. He didn't break anything, not at first. He simply went very still, very quiet, and in that quiet, every man in the room understood that the careful, calculating leader they answered to had been replaced by something far older and far less reasonable. "Get me Salvatore Greco's location," he said, his voice perfectly level, perfectly calm, in a way that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. "Get me his son's location. Get me every Greco soldier's location, every safe house, every property they own, under every shell company they think we don't know about. I want it in 20 minutes. Boss, we don't know they're behind this." "Get me the information, Nico. I'll decide who's behind it." It took 11 minutes, not 20. The trail wasn't even particularly well hidden. Salvatore Greco, in his rage and his wounded pride, had grown careless, had used men whose phones pinged off towers near a Greco-owned warehouse in Red Hook, had moved with the arrogance of a man who believed the Morettis would be too paralyzed by shock to respond quickly. He had badly misjudged his opponent. Damiano arrived at the warehouse with 11 men 40 minutes after the kidnapping, and what followed inside those walls was not negotiation. There was no demand for ransom exchanged, no careful diplomatic dance between crime families trying to avoid all-out war. Damiano walked through the front entrance of that warehouse with a gun in each hand and a silence in his chest that had replaced every ounce of his usual calculation. And the men inside, Greco soldiers, 6 of them, armed and braced for exactly this confrontation, discovered within 90 seconds that bracing for it and surviving it were 2 entirely different propositions. He found Elena in a back room, tied to a chair, a bruise already darkening along her cheekbone where someone had struck her for screaming too loudly, her eyes wide and wild with terror that transformed, the instant she saw him in the doorway, into something closer to disbelief, as though some part of her, even in the depths of her fear, had known with absolute certainty that he would come. "Damiano, I'm here." He was across the room before the second word left her mouth, his hands shaking, actually shaking, for the first time in longer than he could remember, as he tore through the ropes binding her wrists. I'm here, you're safe. I'm not letting anything happen to you. I swear to God, Elena, I swear." He pulled her out of the chair and into his arms with a force that should have hurt, and somehow only felt like the only safe place in the world. And Elena collapsed against his chest, finally letting the sobs she'd been holding back for 2 terrified hours tear loose, her hands fisting in his shirt as though letting go might mean he'd disappear. I thought She gasped against his chest. "I thought they were going to." "They're not going to do anything to you. Not ever. Not while I'm breathing." His voice broke on the words, rough with an emotion too large for the moment to contain. "I should have had more men on you. I should have seen this coming. I'm so sorry, Cara. I'm so sorry." "You came." She pulled back just enough to look at his face, her own tear-streaked and bruised, and looking up at him with an expression that undid something in his chest entirely. "You actually came. I knew you would. Even when I was so scared I couldn't think, some part of me just knew." "I will always come." He framed her face with both hands, his thumb brushing carefully, achingly gently over the bruise on her cheekbone, and the tenderness in the gesture was so total, so unguarded, that neither of them noticed in that moment exactly how far it had drifted from anything a brother might reasonably do. "Do you understand me, Elena? There is no version of this world where I don't come for you. None. I would burn it all down. I would burn every single thing your father built, every dollar, every alliance, every life in this organization before I let anything happen to you. You are the only thing in this entire existence that actually matters to me." She stared up at him, breathless, the words landing somewhere far beyond brotherly devotion, and for one long suspended moment, surrounded by the wreckage of a warehouse that had just witnessed 6 men die for the crime of touching her, neither of them said anything at all, because the truth between them had finally grown too large for words to safely hold. She wouldn't sleep alone that night. Neither of them suggested it out loud. It simply happened, the way gravity happens, inevitable and unremarked. Elena curling into the corner of Damiano's bed in the penthouse with the bruise on her cheekbone freshly iced, and her hands still trembling intermittently from shock, and Damiano sitting against the headboard beside her, not touching, not quite, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him like a fire she was finally allowed to sit near. "You should sleep," he said, watching her stare at the ceiling with wide, unblinking eyes. "Every time I close my eyes, I see the van door opening." Her voice was small, stripped of its usual composure. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't found me in time." "Don't." He reached over almost involuntarily and laced his fingers through hers on top of the blanket. "Don't go there. I found you. That's the only part that's real now." She turned onto her side to face him, their joined hands resting between them, and studied his face in the dim light of the bedside lamp neither of them had bothered to turn off. The hard, exhausted lines of his jaw, the dark circles under his eyes, the particular haunted quality that had settled over him since the warehouse, as though he was still, hours later, fighting a battle that had already ended. "You killed all of them," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Does that bother you?" No. The honesty was immediate, unflinching. It would only bother me if I hadn't. She was quiet for a long moment, processing the particular morality of the world she'd been born into, a world where her brother's capacity for absolute, unhesitating violence was not a flaw to be managed, but a wall built specifically to keep her safe. A wall she had spent her entire life standing behind without fully understanding what it cost the man who built it. "What you said," she whispered, "in the warehouse, about burning everything down for me." His thumb moved against her hand, a small, unconscious caress. I meant every word. Damiano. She shifted closer, close enough that she could feel his breath against her forehead, close enough that the careful distance they'd maintained for months collapsed entirely without either of them deciding to let it. What are we doing? What is this? I don't know. The admission seemed to cost him something, dragged up from a place he'd kept locked for years. I've spent 10 years telling myself it would pass, that it was just overprotectiveness, just a brother who'd promised our father he'd keep you safe and took the promise too far. I almost believed it some days. His eyes found hers in the lamplight, dark and raw, and finally, without any pretense of denial. I don't believe it anymore. Not after today. Not after watching you in that chair and feeling something inside me break that had nothing to do with anger. I feel it too. The confession came out on a breath, fragile and terrified. I've felt it for years, and I've hated myself for it every single day. We're not supposed to feel this way about each other, Damiano.
Don't say it.
His voice cracked. Please, Elena, just tonight, just for tonight, don't say the word. She didn't. Instead, she closed the last few inches of distance between them and pressed her lips to his, soft and hesitant and trembling, a question more than a statement. And Damiano made a sound low in his throat, something broken, something that had been starved for years and finally catastrophically fed, before he kissed her back, his hand coming up to cradle the back of her head with a tenderness that contradicted everything the world knew about Damiano Moretti's capacity for gentleness. It was, for both of them, the single most terrifying and most necessary thing either had ever done. They didn't go further than that. Some last fragment of restraint held, some shared understanding that crossing this particular line tonight, in the immediate aftermath of trauma and adrenaline, would be a mistake neither of them could take back cleanly. But they fell asleep, tangled together, Elena's head on his chest, his arms wrapped around her with a fierce, possessive tenderness. And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, neither dreamed of anything at all. They woke at dawn to the particular crushing weight of guilt that arrives after every forbidden thing, the grey morning light stripping away the desperate permission the previous night's terror had granted them. "This can't happen again," Damiano said, sitting up, putting careful distance between them with visible effort, his voice rough with sleep and something far heavier than sleep. "Elena, what we did last night, God, I don't even regret it, and that's the problem. I should regret it. I know what we are." Her voice was quiet, hollow with the particular exhaustion of a person waking up into a problem that hadn't disappeared overnight. "I know exactly what we are, Damiano. I've known my whole life. It doesn't change what I felt last night, and it doesn't change what you said in that warehouse, and I don't know how to put either of those things back where they were before. We have to." He stood, dragging both hands through his hair, his back to her, his shoulders rigid with the effort of self-control. "We have to find a way to put it back, because the alternative is—" He stopped, turned. His face, in the grey morning light, looked older than she'd ever seen it, haunted by a war that had no clean victory on either side. "The alternative is something I can't let myself imagine, Eleanor. Not without losing the last bit of control I have left." She watched him leave the room and lay alone in the rumpled sheets, with the taste of him still on her mouth, and understood, with a despair that had nowhere left to hide, that whatever line they had crossed the night before could not be uncrossed, no matter how many mornings arrived to insist otherwise. It was 3 months later, in the quiet, unremarkable course of settling his father's remaining estate affairs, that Damiano found the envelope. He hadn't been looking for anything unusual. He'd simply been going through the last of Vittorio Moretti's private filing cabinet at the Long Island house, a task he'd put off for nearly 6 years, the particular grief of sorting through a dead man's papers, something he'd avoided with the same stubbornness he brought to most emotional reckonings. When his hand closed around a manila folder tucked behind a false back panel he hadn't even known existed. The kind of hidden compartment a careful man builds for things he never once found by accident. Inside the folder, a single sealed envelope, yellowed slightly with age, addressed in his father's handwriting to no one, simply marked in block letters, "For Sophia, if I am not there to tell her myself." Beneath the envelope, a hospital discharge form from a private maternity clinic in rural Pennsylvania, dated 24 years and 7 months ago. The patient name listed was not Sophia Moretti. The patient name was Katerina Hale. The attending physician's notes, brief and clinical, recorded the birth of a healthy female infant, 6 pounds 4 ounces, and noted in a separate line that made Damiano's blood run suddenly, completely cold, that the birth mother had died of postpartum hemorrhage 4 hours after delivery. Beneath that, a second document, a birth certificate, listing the infant's name as Elena Hale, father listed as Enzo Moretti, Damiano's uncle, a man who had been dead 4 days before this document was even filed, shot in a parking garage in Newark in a hit that the family had always attributed to a territorial dispute with the Bonanno crew, a dispute that had supposedly ended cleanly with Enzo's death and nothing more. Beneath that, and here Damiano's hands had actually begun to shake, the careful control that had defined his entire adult life finally cracking under the weight of what he was holding, a third document, an amended birth certificate, filed 11 days after the first, listing the same child under a different name. Elena Moretti, father Vittorio Moretti, mother Sophia Moretti. The original certificate, sealed, stamped, archived under a court order obtained through channels that, even now, even reading it with his own eyes, Damiano recognized as the unmistakable signature of money and threat, doing exactly what money and threat were designed to do. He sat on the floor of his dead father's study for 40 minutes without moving, the documents spread in front of him, like the pieces of a bomb he'd just discovered buried under his own house, his mind working through implications with the same cold, methodical efficiency he applied to everything else in his life, except this time the calculations kept arriving at the same impossible, vertiginous conclusion. Elena was not his sister. Elena had never been his sister, not by blood, not by any biological measure that mattered to the world they lived in, not in any way that should have made every feeling he'd spent 10 years burying under shame and self-loathing actually, technically, forbidden. She was his cousin, his uncle's daughter, born to a woman named Katerina Hale, who had died, bringing her into a world that had killed her father days before she'd even drawn breath. A daughter absorbed into the Moretti family not through love or biology, but through the particular, ruthless calculus of a crime family protecting its own bloodline narrative, hiding an inconvenient illegitimate child and a dead infant daughter behind the same sealed document. building an entire lie that two children would grow up inside without ever once suspecting the foundation beneath their feet was hollow. He didn't know yet why his father had hidden it this thoroughly, why even his mother had apparently buried the truth so deep that her own moment of grief on the terrace, "I will not lose another child," had nearly slipped free before she caught herself. He didn't know what exact secret had died with Vittorio Moretti, or what part of it Sofia still carried alone. He knew only one thing, with absolute bone-deep certainty, as he sat on that study floor, with his entire understanding of his own life rewritten in front of him. Every single feeling he had spent a decade torturing himself over, every desire he had buried under shame thick enough to choke on, was not, in fact, the sin he had believed it to be. It was something else entirely. Something that, in this family's bloody and complicated world, might actually be allowed. He should have felt relief. Instead, sitting alone in his dead father's study, with a decade of guilt suddenly and violently dissolving, what Damiano Moretti felt first, before relief, before joy, before anything resembling lightness, was a cold, sharpening dread, because some part of him, the part trained since childhood to see every piece of information as a potential weapon, already understood that a secret this large, buried this deep, protected by forged documents and a murder the family had spent 24 years not properly investigating, was not a gift. It was a fuse. And he had absolutely no idea yet who else might already know where it led. He didn't tell Elena, not yet, not until he understood the full shape of what he was holding. He drove to Pennsylvania alone, 3 days after finding the documents, to the small town listed on the discharge form, and found the maternity clinic, long since closed, converted into a dental office that had no records predating its current ownership. It took 2 more days and a quiet, expensive conversation with a records broker the family kept on retainer for exactly this kind of work to track down what had happened to the clinic's archived files after closure. Sold, along with the building, to a holding company that turned out, after another day of digging, to be owned by a trust connected to the Moretti family's longtime personal attorney, a man named Aldo Bianchi, who had died 8 years ago and taken whatever he knew with him. The only living person who might know the full truth, Damiano realized with growing unease, was his own mother. He found her on a Sunday afternoon, alone in the Long Island house she still maintained, though she rarely stayed there anymore. Sitting in the garden, where she'd planted roses every spring for 30 years, and he laid the documents on the table in front of her, without preamble, without softening, watching her face as the careful composure of a lifetime finally, completely collapsed. "Where did you find these?" Sofia whispered, her hand trembling as it hovered over the papers without quite touching them, as though they might burn her. "In Dad's study, behind a panel I didn't know existed." Damiano sat across from her, his voice level despite the storm raging underneath it. "I need you to tell me everything, Mum, from the beginning, right now." Sofia closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, 24 years of careful silence finally broke loose like a dam giving way. "I lost a daughter," she said quietly. "Did you know that? Before any of this, I was pregnant again, 4 years after you, and she lived. She lived 40 hours, Damiano, 40 hours in an incubator, and then her heart just stopped, and there was nothing anyone could do, and I have never, not once in 24 years, told another living soul outside this family that she existed at all. Mum, let me finish. Her voice was raw, scraped down to something Damiano had never heard from her before, not even at his father's funeral. 4 days after we buried her, in a private plot, no funeral, no record, your father's decision, to protect the family from any sign of weakness, your Uncle Enzo was killed, shot dead over a debt dispute that I have since learned, far too late to matter, was not really about money at all.
It was the Bonanos sending a message that they intended to wipe out every Moretti who carried Enzo's specific bloodline, because Enzo had fathered a child with a woman outside the life, a woman named Caterina, and the Bonanos believed, wrongly as it turned out, but believed it with enough conviction to act on, that this child represented a claim Enzo intended to use against them in a territory dispute that had nothing to do with her at all. They wanted to kill a baby, Damiano said flatly, over a territory dispute she had nothing to do with. This life does not discriminate in who it's willing to sacrifice. Sophia's eyes had gone distant, lost in a memory she had clearly relived 1,000 private times. Caterina died giving birth to her, 4 hours after delivery, in a clinic 2 counties from here that your father chose specifically because it was far enough from the city to keep it quiet. He went to collect the baby himself, intending, I don't fully know what he intended, Damiano. Grief makes men do strange things, and your father was grieving Enzo as much as he was protecting the family. But when he came home with her, and I saw her face for the first time 4 days after burying my own daughter, who had lived less than 2 days. She stopped, pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. I asked him to let me keep her, Sophia whispered. I asked him to let the world believe she was mine.
It wasn't a calculated decision, Damiano, not at first. It was a grieving mother who couldn't bear an empty nursery, looking at a baby who needed a mother and had none, and a family desperate to erase any trace that she existed before the Bonanos finished what they'd started. It became calculated later. It became something your father and I built an entire structure of lies to protect, because the alternative, telling the world that the Moretti Don's daughter was actually his murdered brother's illegitimate child by an outside woman, would have destroyed everything. The Commission does not extend the same protections to illegitimate bloodlines. Rival families would have seen her as a liability instead of an asset, a loose thread instead of a treasured daughter. And the Bonanos, if they'd ever learned she survived, would have finished the job they started in that parking garage. The garden had gone very quiet. Somewhere beyond the hedges, a car passed on the road, ordinary and oblivious to the magnitude of what was unravelling inside this particular patch of carefully tended roses. She doesn't know, Sophia said, finally looking up to meet her son's eyes, her own filled with a grief and a terror 24 years in the making. Elena has never known any of this. As far as she has ever understood her own existence, she is my daughter, your father's daughter, your full-blood sister. I built her entire identity on a lie I told to survive my own grief, and I have spent every single day since terrified of the moment someone finally found what you just found. Why didn't you destroy it? Damiano's voice was rough. If it was this dangerous, why keep the documents at all? Because your father couldn't. Sophia's voice broke entirely now, the last of her composure finally giving way. He told me, near the end, that he needed someone to know the truth in case something happened to him before he found the courage to tell her himself. He never found that courage, Damiano. He died still planning to find it someday.
and I have spent 6 years since unable to either destroy what he left behind or finally use it, because I do not know what telling her would do to her, and I have already watched this family lose enough." Damiano sat in silence for a long time, the documents on the table between them, his entire understanding of his own life rearranged twice in the span of 1 week, once in his father's study, and again now in his mother's grief-soaked confession, the full shape of the lie finally visible in all its terrible, intricate architecture. "I have to tell her," he said finally. "Damiano, she deserves to know who she is, Mum." His voice carried a finality that ended the conversation more thoroughly than any argument could have. "And there's something else you don't know yet, something that makes this more complicated than even you understand." Sophia's eyes searched his face, dread visibly gathering behind them, some maternal instinct already arriving, half a step ahead of the words, at a conclusion she clearly didn't want to reach. "Damiano," she said slowly, "what have you done?" He told her everything eventually. His mother first, in that garden, the confession of a decade's worth of forbidden feeling finally spoken aloud to another living person, watched over by rose bushes, and a grief that had just gotten infinitely more complicated. Sophia had not screamed, had not collapsed, had simply gone very still and very pale, and said, after a long, terrible silence, "Oh my God. Oh my God, I should have seen this years ago," before pressing both hands over her face and weeping in a way Damiano had never witnessed from his mother in his entire life. He told Elena 3 days after that, in the penthouse on a Thursday evening, with the city laid out gold and indifferent beyond the windows, and the telling took almost 2 hours, because she made him repeat parts of it twice, 3 times, her face moving through disbelief and shock, and a grief so profound it seemed to physically diminish her, curling smaller and smaller into the corner of the couch as the full architecture of her own life dissolved and reformed in front of her. "I'm not your sister," she said finally, when he'd finished, the words emerging flat and strange, like a phrase in a foreign language she was testing for the first time. "I'm not Mum's daughter. I'm not even... I don't even know who I actually am, Damiana. My whole name, my whole identity, it's all just..." She made a small, broken gesture with her hand, encompassing 24 years of a life built on borrowed foundations. "It's all just something you people decided to tell me." "Elena, don't," her voice cracked. "Don't try to make this gentle right now. I need a minute. I need more than a minute. I need to understand how I spent my entire life believing I was someone I'm not, while everyone around me apparently knew otherwise. Mum didn't know I felt anything for you until a few months ago, and she didn't know I'd found the documents until last week. You weren't the only one kept in the dark, Elena. We both were, in different ways, our entire lives." "That's not the same thing." She stood, pacing the length of the living room with the restless, caged energy of a person trying to outrun a feeling too large for her body to contain. "You at least got to grow up as yourself. I grew up as someone's replacement, a dead baby's replacement, Damiano. That's what I am. A grieving woman's attempt to fill an empty nursery, and a family's solution to a murder problem. And I have spent 24 years thinking I was loved for being me, when really I was just convenient, useful, a story everyone agreed to tell. That's not true. He crossed to her, caught her by the shoulders, forced her to stop pacing and look at him. Elena, listen to me. My mother didn't keep you because you were convenient. She kept you because she looked at a motherless baby and couldn't let her go. Grief or not, calculation or not. And my father, whatever else he did, whatever lies he built around you, he loved you, Elena. I watched him with you my entire childhood. That love wasn't a performance. None of it was a performance. And you? Her eyes, wet and furious and devastated, finally lifted to his. What were your feelings for me, Damiano? Was that a performance too, or was it always— She stopped, the question too large, too dangerous to finish out loud, even now, even with everything else already broken open between them. You know it wasn't a performance. His voice had dropped, low and rough, his hands tightening slightly on her shoulders. Elena, do you understand what this means? Do you understand what I'm actually telling you? That we're not related. The words came out of her slowly, like she was testing the shape of them, watching for the trap. That we never were. That everything I've hated myself for, every single day for years, every dream I woke up ashamed of, every time I looked at you and felt something no sister should feel, none of it was actually wrong. Not in the way I thought. No. His thumb brushed against her jaw, careful, reverent, an echo of the gesture in the warehouse, but stripped now of every layer of guilt that had haunted it then. It was never wrong, Eleanor. It was just early. It found us before the truth did, and we spent years punishing ourselves for something that was never actually a sin. The grief and the shock and the years of buried longing collided in her chest all at once, and Eleanor made a sound that was half sob, half something closer to laughter. The disorienting, hysterical relief of a person discovering that the prison she'd built her entire identity around had never had real walls. Say it, she whispered, her hands fisting in the front of his shirt. The same gesture from the warehouse, except this time there was no fear underneath it, only something fierce and finally unashamed. Damiano, say it. I need to hear you actually say it. I love you. The words came out of him, broken open, years of careful denial finally collapsing entirely. I have loved you since I was old enough to understand what love even was, and I have hated myself for it every single day since I was old enough to understand it was supposed to be forbidden. I am not your brother, Elena. I never was, and I am done. I am so completely done, pretending I don't want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you. She kissed him before he'd finished the sentence, fierce and unguarded, and finally, without a single particle of shame, and Damiano lifted her against him with a desperate, hungry tenderness, 10 years of restraint dissolving into a single, devastating moment of permission. And somewhere beneath the joy and the relief crashing through both of them, a quieter, more dangerous thought was already taking root in the back of Damiano's mind, one he would not allow himself to voice until morning. The truth has set us free. Now, we have to make sure no one else ever finds out it exists. Morning arrived, as it always did, with consequences.
They lay tangled together in Damiano's bed, the city waking up beyond the windows. And for one suspended hour, neither of them spoke about anything beyond the immediate, overwhelming relief of finally being allowed to want each other without the weight of imagined sin crushing the wanting flat. Elena traced the lines of his chest with idle fingers, marvelling at the strange lightness in her own body, as though she'd been carrying an invisible stone for years and had only just now noticed its absence.
"We have to tell people," she said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence. "Don't we? If it's not actually wrong, if we're not actually related, we should be able to just tell people, Damiano. Be normal. Date like normal people. Eventually get married. Have a life that doesn't require us to hide in penthouses and lie to everyone we know." She felt him go still beneath her, his hand stilling against her back, and some instinct, honed over a lifetime of reading his moods, told her the answer before he spoke it. "We can't," he said quietly. "What do you mean, we can't? You said it yourself. We're not related. There's no sin here, no actual law we're breaking. Eleanor, listen to me." He sat up, pulling her with him, his face serious in a way that made her stomach drop with renewed dread. "The world we live in doesn't operate on the truth. It operates on what people believe, and what they believe right now, what every family in this city believes, what the Commission believes, what every single rival who'd love an excuse to destroy us believes, is that you are my full-blood sister, the legitimate daughter of Vittorio and Sofia Moretti. That belief is part of the foundation this entire family's legitimacy rests on." "I don't understand." "My father killed for a man's lie. He buried a dead infant in an unmarked grave and let the world believe she'd never existed, specifically so that no one would ever question whether the woman raised as Eleanor Moretti was a true Moretti by blood. That belief protects you, Eleanor. If word ever got out that you were actually Enzo's daughter, Caterina Hale's daughter, an outsider's child, absorbed into this family through a lie and a forged birth certificate, it wouldn't just be scandal. The Bonanos believed 24 years ago that Enzo's bloodline represented a claim against their territory dangerous enough to justify murder. I don't know if that's still true today, or if it's even rational anymore, but I am not willing to gamble your life on the hope that old grudges have faded. And beyond that, the Commission does not recognize illegitimate, outside-blood children as legitimate heirs to anything. If they learn the truth, they won't just question your place in this family, they'll question my entire claim to leadership, because half my authority rests on the unbroken Moretti bloodline narrative my father spent his whole life protecting. Salvatore Greco would use it within the hour. He's already humiliated and furious over the marriage rejection. Give him proof that the Moretti throne rests on a forged document and a hidden murder, and he won't need an army to destroy us. He'll just need a single phone call to the right people. Elena sat in silence, the weight of his words settling over her like a physical thing, the brief, beautiful lightness of the morning curdling back into something far more familiar, the suffocating, inescapable architecture of a world that had never once, in her entire life, allowed her to simply exist without strategic calculation attached to every part of her. "So, what are you saying?" Her voice had gone flat. "That we love each other, finally, for the first time without guilt, and the answer is to go right back to pretending? To be siblings in public and something else entirely behind closed doors?" "I'm saying that's exactly what we have to do."
His jaw was tight, his eyes pained, and she could see, even through her own rising despair, that the solution cost him as much as it cost her. I'm saying the truth that finally freed us from our own guilt is a truth that could get us both killed if it ever reaches the wrong ears. We protect it the way my parents protected it. Completely, absolutely, for the rest of our lives, if that's what it takes. We continue as Elena and Damiano Moretti, brother and sister, in every public room, every commission dinner, every photograph, every conversation with anyone outside the four people who now know the truth. And in private, we get to be exactly what we actually are. Her voice cracked on the words, bitter and grieving and exhausted all at once. A secret. A lie wrapped inside the lie we already spent our whole lives living. God, Damiano, is there any version of us that doesn't require hiding? He pulled her against him, his arms tightening with a fierce, desperate certainty that did nothing to soften the impossible math of what he was asking of her. I know it's not what you wanted. I know you wanted the world to finally make sense, finally be simple, finally let you just be a woman who fell in love instead of a secret someone has to protect. But I will not lose you to a war we don't have to start. I have buried enough people this family loved. I am not burying you over the truth of a birth certificate. And if someone finds out anyway? She whispered against his chest, despite everything we do to hide it? Damiano's silence stretched out long enough that Elena lifted her head to look at his face, and found there an expression she recognized immediately, because she had seen it once before, in a warehouse in Red Hook, on a night that had ended with 6 men dead for the crime of touching her. Then I burn down whoever threatens you, he said quietly, the same way I always have. Some things about us were never a lie, Elena. That's one of them. They built a life inside the lie, the way people sometimes build entire houses on land they know is slowly sinking, carefully, deliberately, with the constant low-grade awareness that the ground beneath them could not be entirely trusted. In public, nothing changed. Elena still attended galas on her brother's arm, still played the role of the protected heiress, still smiled at commission dinners, while Damiano sat at the head of tables full of men who would have destroyed them both for the truth they now shared. They perfected the choreography of siblings even more thoroughly than before, painfully aware now of every gesture that might read as more than familial, every glance that lasted a half-second too long, every accidental touch that had to be calibrated with the precision of actors hitting their marks. In private, in the penthouse, behind locked doors, in the hours between the world's demands, they became something neither of them had ever been allowed to be before. Simply, uncomplicatedly, happy. It was strange learning how to love someone you'd already loved your entire life, except now without the architecture of shame holding everything at arm's length. Elena discovered that Damiano laughed more in private than she'd ever witnessed, a low, surprised sound that seemed to startle even him sometimes, like he was still getting used to the unfamiliar lightness of having nothing left to hide from himself. Damiano discovered that Elena, freed from years of careful self-monitoring, was fiercer and funnier and far more stubborn than the version of herself she'd performed for the world, a woman who argued with him about business decisions she had no formal authority over and was, usually,
infuriatingly right. They were careful. They were so careful, it became its own kind of exhausting intimacy. Separate bedrooms maintained for the staff's benefit, careful schedules around the household help's hours, a code worked out between them for warning each other when family or business associates arrived unannounced. They told no one beyond Sophia, who had, after the initial shock, settled into something that looked almost like relief, as though watching her son and the daughter she'd raised finally find happiness. Even a hidden, complicated happiness eased some of the guilt she'd carried for 24 years. "I should have told her sooner," Sophia admitted to Damiano one evening, watching from the kitchen window as Elena laughed at something in the garden below, sunlight catching in her dark hair. "I told myself I was protecting her." Some of that was true, but some of it, Damiano, was simply cowardice. I was afraid of what telling the truth would cost me. The daughter I'd raised, believing she was mine by blood, suddenly knowing otherwise. I was selfish in my grief, and she paid for it, without ever knowing she was paying. "You can't undo it now," Damiano said, "but you can stop apologizing for it and just be the mother you've actually been to her for 24 years. Blood or not, you raised her. That's not nothing, Mum." Sophia had reached up and touched her son's face then, an old gesture from his childhood, and said nothing more, but something in her posture had eased. Some long-carried weight finally, partially set down. It was, for nearly 4 months, almost peaceful. Damiano found himself for the first time in his adult life, considering a future that didn't revolve solely around the relentless maintenance of power. Considering, in the private hours when Elena slept curled against him, what it might look like to actually build something with her, somewhere far from the Commission's reach, a life neither of them had ever been permitted to imagine. He should have known better than to let himself imagine it. In their world, peace was never a destination. It was only ever a held breath before the next storm. The storm arrived in the form of a man named Marco Esposito, a Greco soldier who had been quietly, methodically combing through every piece of Moretti history he could find since the night Salvatore Greco had walked away from the marriage humiliation with a bruised reputation and a burning need for leverage. Esposito had spent 6 months working contacts in upstate hospital records, tracking down retired clinic staff, paying for information with the patient, expensive thoroughness of a man who knew his employer would reward results far more than he'd reward speed. He found what he was looking for in the 7th month of searching, a retired records clerk in rural Pennsylvania who remembered, for the right price, an unusual birth certificate amendment processed under strange circumstances 24 years earlier. A memory corroborated by a yellowed carbon copy she'd illegally kept in a personal file out of nothing more than idle curiosity decades ago. It was not the original documents, it was not absolute court-admissible proof, but it was enough, more than enough, for a man like Salvatore Greco, desperate for any weapon against the family that had humiliated his son, to begin building a plan designed not merely to embarrass the Morettis, but to dismantle their entire claim to legitimate power. Elena and Damiano, 400 peaceful evenings into their secret happiness, had absolutely no idea that the fuse Damiano had feared the night he found his father's hidden envelope had finally, quietly, been lit. The first sign of trouble arrived disguised as an invitation,
Salvatore Greco requested a private meeting, not the usual neutral ground commission affair, but a one-on-one sit-down at his own estate in Brooklyn Heights, the kind of request that, between Mafia dons, carried weight far beyond its simple language.
Damiano went because refusing would have been its own kind of admission, and because some instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive through a dozen lesser betrayals, told him that whatever Salvatore wanted to discuss was not going to be the shipping arrangement. He was right. "You have a beautiful family, Damiano." Salvatore Greco poured 2 glasses of grappa with the unhurried ceremony of a man who enjoyed watching people wait for the point. He was 68, built like a man who'd once been genuinely dangerous and had since let comfort soften the edges, though his eyes remained sharp, calculating, entirely unsoftened by age. "Your father built something extraordinary, the kind of legacy most men in this life only dream about." "You didn't invite me here to compliment my father's legacy." "No." Salvatore's smile thinned. "I invited you here because I've recently come into possession of some very interesting historical documentation. Hospital records, birth certificates, the kind of paperwork that tells a very different story than the one your family has spent 24 years asking everyone to believe." The room went very quiet. Damiano kept his face perfectly still, a discipline trained into him since childhood, though underneath the surface his entire body had gone cold, with a dread sharper than any he'd felt since the night Elena had been taken. "I don't know what you think you have," he said evenly, "but I'd be careful about acting on rumours, Salvatore. They have a way of getting men killed." "Is that a threat?" "It's an observation." Salvatore laughed, a low, unpleasant sound, and slid a folder across the table. "Not the originals," Damiano noted immediately, with the small, cold relief of a man checking for the worst possible outcome and finding something marginally less catastrophic. "But photocopies. Second-hand reconstructions of records his investigator had pieced together from a retired clerk's illegal carbon copy. Enough to be dangerous. Not yet enough to be irrefutable." "Your sister," Salvatore said, watching Damiano's face with the patient attention of a predator who had already decided how this conversation would end, "is not actually your sister. She's your Uncle Enzo's bastard daughter by some outside woman, smuggled into your family under a forged birth certificate after your mother's real daughter died in an incubator." 24 years, Damiano. Your entire family's legitimacy built on a lie about whose blood actually sits on that throne you inherited. He leaned back, satisfaction radiating off him like heat. "I imagine the Commission would find that information very interesting. I imagine certain old friends of mine, who never quite finished settling a score with your uncle's bloodline, would find it interesting too." "What do you want?" Damiano's voice had dropped into the flat, dangerous register that men who knew him had learned to fear far more than shouting. "What I originally wanted." Salvatore's smile sharpened. "The alliance. My son and the girl you've been so fiercely, unnaturally protective of all these years. And now I understand exactly why, don't I? Funny how a man's overprotection of a sister makes a great deal more sense when you learn she isn't actually his sister at all." He let the implications sit in the air, ugly and deliberate. "Nico marries her. The families merge properly, the way they should have months ago. In exchange, this documentation disappears, and your little secret about Elena's blood, And whatever else might be happening behind closed doors in that penthouse of yours, Damiano, because I am not a stupid man, and I have heard the rumours too, stays buried where it belongs. The silence that followed was the most dangerous Damiano had ever sat inside. Every instinct in his body screamed toward violence, toward ending this threat the way he ended every other threat to Elena's safety. Swift, total, without negotiation. But violence here, against a sitting Don, in his own home, over an accusation Salvatore had been careful enough to deliver without witnesses, would trigger exactly the kind of war the Commission existed to prevent. And a war right now, with this particular leverage hanging over his family's legitimacy, was a war the Morettis could not survive cleanly. "I'll consider your proposal," Damiano said finally, each word costing him something visible in the tight line of his jaw. "Don't take too long." Salvatore's smile widened, victorious. "I'd hate for this information to find its way to the wrong ears before we've had a chance to come to an understanding." Damiano left the Greco estate with murder sitting quiet and patient in his chest, and the absolute, unshakable certainty that Salvatore Greco's threat against Elena's safety, implicit in every word, however carefully softened by the language of business, had just become a problem that no negotiation, no alliance, no clever manoeuvring through commission politics was ever going to solve. There was only one solution Damiano Moretti had ever truly trusted in his entire life, and it had nothing to do with marriage contracts. He told Elena everything that same night, because he had promised himself, after the warehouse, after the lie of their childhood, that he would never again let her face a threat to her life without the full truth of what it actually was. She listened in silence, sitting very still on the couch in the penthouse, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and when he finished, she said the thing he had least expected and most feared. "Marry him." "What?" "Nico Greco." Her voice was steady, terrifyingly steady, the voice of a woman who had already done the math and arrived at a conclusion she hated. "If that's what makes this go away, Damiano." "No." The word came out of him like a gunshot, immediate and absolute. "Absolutely not. I am not handing you over to that family to buy a documents folder, Elena. We are not having this conversation." "You'd rather start a war? Risk the commission turning on us, risk the Bananos finishing whatever they started 24 years ago, risk everything your father built over me?" "Yes." He crossed to her, knelt in front of where she sat, took both her hands in his with a fierceness that left no room for argument. "Elena, listen to me. There is no version of this life where I trade you for safety. There never was, even when I thought you were my blood sister. There certainly isn't now, when you're the only thing in this entire world I actually want to keep. I would rather burn this whole empire to the ground than watch you marry a man who would only ever see you as a transaction." "Then what do we do?" Her composure finally cracked, fear bleeding through the careful steadiness she'd been holding. "Damiano, he has proof, or close enough to proof. If it reaches the commission, it won't." His voice had gone quiet, certain, the particular calm he wore right before he made a decision that would end someone's life. "Because Salvatore Greco is not going to live long enough to use it." "Damiano, I'm not asking your permission, Elena. I'm telling you what's going to happen, because you deserve to know, and because I will not let you carry the guilt of not knowing." He held her gaze, unflinching, the weight of 100 similar decisions visible behind his eyes. Salvatore made a mistake tonight. He showed me his hand without protecting himself first. He thinks the threat of exposure keeps him safe, that I won't move against him while that documentation exists somewhere outside his control. He's wrong. I'm going to find every copy of that documentation before I move, and then I'm going to remove the man who weaponized it against you, the same way I've removed every other threat to your life since I was 19 years old. The only difference this time is the stakes. What followed was not war in the way the underworld typically understood it. No public bloodshed, no Jai corner shootings, no message-sending massacres that would draw police attention and commission scrutiny. It was something colder, more surgical. The kind of operation that took 3 weeks of careful planning rather than 3 minutes of violent improvisation. Nico Falcone tracked down the retired records clerk in Pennsylvania within 4 days, paid her triple what Salvatore's man had paid, and walked away not just with her cooperation, but with the original illegal carbon copy she'd kept for 2 decades, the single physical artifact that gave Salvatore's threat any teeth at all. 2 more weeks of careful surveillance identified exactly where Salvatore kept the photocopied folder. A safe in his Brooklyn Heights study, behind a painting his late wife had chosen, guarded by a security system the Morettis had, through a contractor on retainer for exactly this kind of work, helped install 8 years earlier, and never disclosed they retained backdoor access to. The documentation was retrieved on a Tuesday night, while Salvatore Greco slept 15 feet away, oblivious. Salvatore Greco did not survive the following Friday. It was made to look, with the particular meticulous craft Damiano's organization had perfected over decades, like a heart attack, sudden, tragic, entirely unremarkable for a 68-year-old man with a known cardiac history and a lifetime of poor habits behind him. No bruises, no signs of struggle, nothing for a medical examiner with no particular reason to look closely to question. Nico Greco inherited his father's seat within the week, devastated, suspicious in the private, paranoid way men in their world were always suspicious of convenient deaths, but utterly unable to prove anything beyond his own grief-fueled instinct, and far too aware of his own family's diminished position, without his father's documentation, without the leverage that had briefly made the Grecos dangerous again, to act on suspicion alone. Elena learned what had happened the morning after, reading it not from Damiano directly, but from the careful, clinical understatement he used whenever he wanted her to understand something without forcing her to absorb the full weight of it directly. It's handled. The documentation is destroyed. Salvatore won't be a problem anymore. She had sat with the phone in her hands for a long time, understanding exactly what those 3 sentences meant, feeling the particular vertigo of loving a man whose love for her translated without hesitation into the deaths of anyone who threatened it. She had not condemned him. She had told herself, in the privacy of her own conscience, that she should, that a better, gentler version of herself would recoil from what he'd done, would demand the different kind of love that didn't require bodies in its wake. But when Damiano came home that evening, exhausted and grim, and watching her with the particular wariness of a man bracing for judgment he believed he deserved, she had simply crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him and felt him exhale, all at once, like a man finally allowed to set down a weight he'd been carrying alone. "I should be horrified," she admitted against his chest. "I'm not. I don't know what that says about either of us. It says we belong to the same world." His arms tightened around her, his voice rough with relief and exhaustion both. It says you understand, finally and completely, exactly what kind of man you fell in love with. I will never be safe to love in any ordinary way, Eleanor. I will always choose your survival over anyone else's, including my own conscience. If that frightens you, it doesn't. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes steady, certain. It terrifies me sometimes. It doesn't frighten me away. There's a difference, Damiano, and I think you know it. Peace, when it returned, arrived carrying the particular fragility of something rebuilt rather than restored. Nico Greco, despite his suspicions, made no move against the Morettis in the months that followed his father's death. Too occupied with consolidating his own shaky hold on the Greco organization. Too aware that an unprovoked war against a stronger family would likely finish what his father's gambit had failed to start. The Commission, satisfied with the official cause of death and uninterested in disturbing a fragile peace between two powerful families, closed the matter without ceremony. The carbon copy that had threatened to unravel 24 years of careful lies burned in a steel drum behind a Moretti-owned warehouse in Red Hook, the same neighborhood where Damiano had once killed 6 men to retrieve Elena from a chair, ash scattering into a harbour wind that carried it out toward open water and, eventually, nowhere at all. Damiano told himself it was over. He had learned, over a lifetime in this life, never to fully believe that particular comfort. But for nearly a year, the world cooperated with the fiction anyway. Elena flourished in ways that surprised even her. Freed from the immediate threat hanging over her safety, she threw herself into expanding the Moretti Foundation's reach, building genuine philanthropic infrastructure behind what had once been a purely cosmetic charity arm, finding in the work a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with her family's criminal enterprises and everything to do with who she actually wanted to become. Damiano watched her build something entirely her own, with a pride so fierce it sometimes startled him, a feeling that had nothing to do with possession and everything to do with simply, finally, getting to witness her become more fully herself. They were careful still. Careful in public, careful around staff, careful with every choreographed gesture that maintained the fiction the world required of them. But the careful had stopped feeling, most days, like suffocation. It had become, instead, something closer to a private language only the two of them shared, a secret that bound them together rather than one that merely threatened to tear them apart. It was Sophia, on a quiet evening nearly 14 months after the confession in the rose garden, who finally said the thing none of them had dared say aloud since the documents first surfaced. "You should marry her," she said to Damiano, watching Elena across the dinner table, laughing at something Vivian had said, utterly unaware of the conversation happening in low murmurs beside her. Properly, eventually. Quietly, in a way the world doesn't need to fully understand, but properly nonetheless. You've waited long enough, Damiano. You've both earned more than a life lived entirely behind locked doors. You know what marrying her publicly would mean, the questions it would raise. I'm not suggesting you announce it at a commission dinner. Sophia's voice carried the particular dry patience she'd developed over decades of managing her son's tendency toward extremes. I'm suggesting there are ways to build a life that exist between total secrecy and total exposure. A private ceremony. A story the world can accept without ever needing the real one. A marriage between distant cousins, perhaps. Something that explains the closeness without exposing the truth beneath it. People believe what they're given a reasonable story to believe, Damiano. You don't need to hand them the whole truth. You only need to hand them enough of a lie that the real one stays buried. Damiano considered his mother's words for a long moment, watching Elena's face across the table, bright and unguarded, in a way that had become, over the past year, the single most precious sight in his entire, carefully controlled existence. "I'll think about it," he said. He thought about it for exactly 6 weeks, and at the end of those 6 weeks, on a private stretch of beach on an island off the coast of Sicily that the family had owned for 3 generations and that almost no one outside the immediate family knew existed, he asked Elena to marry him with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, in a ceremony that would eventually involve exactly 9 people and a story carefully constructed for anyone who later asked. A quiet love that had bloomed, the official narrative would claim, between Elena Moretti and a distant cousin from the Sicilian branch of the family that almost no one had ever met. A man whose name on the documents would not be Damiano Moretti at all, but a carefully constructed alternate identity, built by people whose entire profession was building exactly this kind of necessary fiction. "You're sure about this?" Elena asked him, the ring catching the last of the Sicilian sunset on her finger, the Mediterranean breaking softly against the shore behind them. An entire false identity, Damiano. An entire second life, just so we can have this. I have spent my whole life building false identities for other people's protection. He brought her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss against the ring, against her knuckles, against the particular impossible miracle of having survived everything the world had thrown at them to arrive at this exact moment. Building one for our own happiness feels, finally, like the first thing I've ever constructed purely for myself, instead of out of obligation. And if someone finds out anyway? Despite the false name, despite every precaution? He looked at her then, the woman who had been his sister and his secret and his deepest forbidden longing, and was now, finally, simply and entirely his wife, and felt the old, familiar certainty settle back into his chest, the one constant that had survived every revelation, every threat, every reconstruction of the truth that had defined their entire shared life. "Then I do what I have always done," he said quietly. "I burn down whoever threatens you, and I keep you safe. And the world keeps believing whatever story it needs to believe to leave us alone. Some things about us were never going to change, Elena. I think you stopped being afraid of that a long time ago." She kissed him on a beach that belonged to a family built on layered lies, wearing a ring that represented one more lie, carefully constructed to protect a truth too dangerous for the world to know, and felt, for the first time in her entire, complicated, secret-laden existence, something that felt remarkably, finally, like peace. 3 years later, the woman the world knew as Elena Moretti stood on the terrace of the Manhattan penthouse, 40 stories above a city that had never once suspected the truth living quietly within its skyline, and watched her husband, known to the world in every official capacity that mattered as her brother, cross the room toward her, with their daughter asleep against his shoulder. Sophia had been right, in the end, about the architecture of necessary lies. The world had accepted, without much scrutiny, the story of a distant Sicilian cousin named Matteo Conti, who had quietly married Elena Moretti in a private ceremony. A man who appeared occasionally at family gatherings under careful management, photographed rarely, discussed less. An invented life built with the same meticulous care the family had once used to disguise an entirely different secret. Damiano Moretti remained in every public record, every commissioned dinner, every photograph that mattered to the outside world, Elena's older brother. Fiercely protective, famously possessive, the Don whose devotion to his sister had become, over the years, a kind of underworld legend that no one ever thought to question too closely. Because the truth, when properly disguised, has a way of looking exactly like the lie everyone already expects to see. Only a handful of people in the world knew that Matteo Conti did not exist outside of forged documents and careful misdirection. Only a handful knew that the baby sleeping against Damiano's shoulder, a daughter they'd named Caterina, after a woman neither of them had ever met, but who had given Elena life at the cost of her own, carried in her small, sleeping face the blood of two people the world believed could never have produced her at all. "She's getting heavy," Damiano said, settling beside Elena at the terrace railing, careful not to wake the child between them. "Falling asleep on me every single night now. I think she does it on purpose." "She does it because she loves you more than anyone else in this family, and she's figured out it's the easiest way to get your undivided attention." Elena reached over and brushed a strand of dark hair from their daughter's forehead, a small, tender gesture that mirrored almost exactly the way Damiano had once touched a baby's fist 27 years ago and made a promise he hadn't fully understood. "She has your stubbornness already, you know. God help us all. She has your eyes. She has both our eyes. That's the whole point of children, Damiano." Elena leaned into him, the city spread out gold and glittering below them, indifferent as always to the particular miracle of survival happening on this terrace 40 stories above it. "Do you ever think about it? How impossible this whole thing was? How many different ways it could have ended badly?" "Every day." His arm came around her, careful of the sleeping baby between them, his voice quiet, in the way it only ever got when he allowed himself to fully feel something instead of controlling it. "I think about the warehouse. I think about the documents I found in my father's study. I think about Salvatore Greco's smile when he thought he had us cornered. I think about every single moment where this could have gone a different way, where I could have lost you, where the truth could have destroyed us instead of freeing us." He pressed a kiss to her temple, his voice rough with a gratitude that had never fully faded despite 3 years of safety. "And every single time, Eleanor, I arrive back at the same conclusion. I would do all of it again. Every lie, every death, every impossible choice. There has never been a single version of my existence where keeping you safe wasn't worth absolutely anything it cost. Even an entire false identity? An entire second life built around a man who doesn't exist? Especially that." He smiled, the rare, unguarded smile she had spent years learning to draw out of him, the one that belonged entirely to her and their daughter, and no one else the world was permitted to see. "Matteo Conti gets to be a man with nothing to protect except his family. No empire, no commission, no legacy to defend with violence." Some days, Elena, I envy him more than I can explain. A man who gets to exist purely for the people he loves, instead of for everything this name requires of me. You're still that man. She turned in his arms, careful of the baby, and pressed her palm flat against his chest, feeling the steady, certain beat of his heart beneath her hand. The same heart that had, 27 years ago, decided to protect a baby girl who turned out to never have been his sister at all, and had spent every year since proving in increasingly extraordinary ways exactly how far that protection would extend. Underneath the dawn, underneath everything this name requires, you've always been that man, Damiano. The name on the documents was never really the point. Below them, the city carried on its endless, indifferent business, deals closing, lives unraveling, other families building other empires on other carefully buried secrets, the particular machinery of a world that ran, in the end, on exactly the kind of lies the Morettis had spent a generation perfecting. None of it touched the terrace where Elena Moretti stood with her husband and her daughter, wrapped in a quiet that had cost more than most people would ever understand, a happiness built on a foundation of forged documents and buried bodies, and a truth so dangerous it could never be spoken outside these walls. It did not feel, standing there, like a tragedy. It felt, after everything, after the years of guilt and the warehouse and the documents and the careful, deliberate violence required to keep a single secret safe, like exactly what it was. A love that had survived every possible reason to die and had simply, stubbornly refused. "I love you," Damiano said quietly, the words no longer carrying the desperate weight of confession they once had, simply true, simply spoken, the way a man states a fact he has long since stopped being afraid of. "I have loved you since before either of us understood what the word meant, and I will love you long after this city forgets every name we've ever used to survive inside it." "I know." Elena rested her head against his shoulder, beside their sleeping daughter, watching the lights of Manhattan blur gold and beautiful through eyes suddenly bright with tears that had nothing to do with sadness. "I've always known, Damiano, even when I was too afraid to say it back, even when the whole world thought we were something we were never actually capable of being." "And now?" "Now," she said, "we just get to keep choosing it every single day, for as long as we both manage to survive long enough to keep choosing." The wind moved across the terrace, carrying the city's distant hum, and somewhere below them, in the careful architecture of lies built to protect exactly this moment, the truth that had once threatened to destroy them both finally settled into something quieter, something permanent. Not a confession waiting to be discovered, not a fuse waiting to be lit, but simply the foundation of a life two people had built, against every possible odd, out of nothing more than a love that had never, despite everyone's worst fears, been the sin the world once believed it to be.